The year America was supposed to die. A true story history never dared to tell. No one noticed the silence at first. That was the most dangerous part. In the winter of 1798, the United States of America, barely 22 years old, began to disappear. Not with explosions, not with invasion fleets, but with empty rooms, unanswered letters, frozen rivers, and a growing realization among a few terrified men that the country might simply stop working. Years later, historians would argue over dates and causes. Some would blame politics. Some would blame France. Others would say the nation was never really in danger at all. They were wrong. Because for 76 days, the American government functioned without knowing whether it still controlled its own people, its own army, or even its own future. And almost no one today remembers why. In December 1798, a man named Samuel Harker woke before dawn in a boarding house in Philadelphia and realized something was wrong. It wasn't the cold. Winters were always cruel in Philadelphia. It wasn't hunger either. He'd learned to ignore that during the war years. It was the quiet. Outside his window, the city that had once served as the beating heart of the Revolution lay still. No carriage wheels, no street vendors, no church bells. Even the river seemed hesitant, its surface thickening with ice in a way Harker had never seen before. Samuel Harker was not important enough to be remembered by history books. He was a clerk, nothing more, employed by a subcommittee of a committee that technically answered to Congress, which itself barely functioned anymore. But what Harker saw that morning would eventually be buried, mislabeled, and deliberately forgotten. He pulled on his coat, stepped into the street, and counted something that chilled him more than the air. Out of 36 houses on his block, 17 were empty. No fire smoke, no footprints, no signs of departure. Just abandonment. The United States in 1798 was a fragile experiment held together by ink, debt, and exhausted hope. The Constitution was barely a decade old, the Bill of Rights younger still. Political parties, something the founders had sworn would destroy the nation, had already done exactly that. The country was split into two hostile camps who no longer trusted each other to define reality. On one side stood the Federalists, led by President John Adams, who believed order was more important than liberty when survival was at stake. On the other stood the Democratic Republicans, followers of Thomas Jefferson, who believed Adams was one bad decision away from becoming a king. Neither side understood how close the nation was to annihilation, because the threat did not come from Britain, or Spain, or native resistance. It came from something far quieter. That same week, ships arriving in Boston Harbor brought rumors no one wanted to repeat. In French-controlled ports, American sailors being seized, ships confiscated, crews imprisoned or vanished. The undeclared naval conflict, later known as the Quasi-War, had begun. But Congress refused to call it a war. War required unity. Unity no longer existed. Instead, the government passed laws designed not to protect the nation, but to control its own people. The Alien and Sedition Acts.
4 laws, passed in fear, enforced in panic. They allowed the president to deport foreigners without trial, to imprison journalists, to criminalize criticism of the government itself. Adams signed them, knowing they might tear the country apart. Jefferson read them, knowing they already had. In Richmond, Virginia, a printer named Eli Turner read the Sedition Act by candlelight and realized he was now a criminal. His crime? He had published an essay questioning whether the president was competent. The next morning, federal marshals came for him. By the end of January 1799, 25 newspaper editors would be arrested across the country. Not for espionage, not for treason, for words. The revolution had been fought over words. Now, words were enough to put a man in chains.
Meanwhile, something worse was happening beyond the reach of any law. The winter of 1798-1799 was not normal. It was catastrophic. Temperatures plunged lower than any living American had recorded. Rivers froze solid enough to carry wagons. Crops rotted in the ground. Grain shipments failed. Coastal trade collapsed under ice. In rural Pennsylvania and New York, farmers slaughtered breeding livestock just to survive. In New England, entire towns abandoned their ports and moved inland, chasing rumors of food. No federal relief existed, no national infrastructure, no system capable of responding. If a town starved, it starved alone. By February, letters stopped arriving in Washington, not because people had stopped writing, because couriers could no longer travel. Frozen roads, bandits, deserters. The young nation's communication network collapsed. Congress met without knowing what was happening beyond the Capitol. The president governed blind. And somewhere between the silence and the snow, mutiny began to grow. At a military outpost near the Ohio frontier, Captain Jonah Kincaid read an order from Philadelphia that arrived 3 months late. It demanded loyalty. It offered no pay. Kincaid looked at the men under his command, barefoot, starving, armed, and understood something his superiors did not. These men no longer feared the government. They feared hunger more, and hunger listens to no constitution. In March, whispers reached Jefferson's allies of something unthinkable. Several state legislatures were considering nullifying federal law, not protesting, not resisting, ignoring it entirely. If one state did it, the Union might survive. If many did, the Union would fracture. And if the Army chose sides, there would be no United States to save. The miracle is not that America almost collapsed. The miracle is that it didn't. And the reason has almost nothing to do with the men whose faces are carved in stone. It has to do with hidden negotiations, buried documents, illegal compromises, and one decision made in secret that violated the Constitution but saved the nation. A decision history politely refuses to name. By April 1799, Samuel Harker would be ordered to burn a ledger he had spent months compiling. He would hesitate, then obey, and with that fire, a chapter of American history would vanish, not erased by accident, but by design.
The ledger Samuel Harker was ordered to destroy did not begin as a secret. That was the lie history later told itself. It began as a practical solution to a problem no one wanted to admit existed. The federal government had lost track of its own country. In January 1799, Harker's job was simple, on paper. He was to record delayed correspondence, missing reports, and unexplained absences from federal offices across the states. A temporary measure, Congress said, a clerical cleanup. But by the third week, the ledger had stopped looking like paperwork and started looking like an autopsy. Entire districts had gone silent. Tax collectors reported doors unopened for weeks. Customs officials vanished from ports that were technically still operational. Militia rolls listed men who had not been seen since the first heavy snows. In some counties, federal authority existed only as ink on parchment. Harker noticed something else, too, something no one had asked him to track: patterns. Silence clustered. It spread outward from ports, from frontier posts, from places where food ran out first, where pay arrived last, where loyalty had always been thinnest. The United States was not collapsing evenly. It was hollowing out. President John Adams received fragments of this reality secondhand, distorted by delay and denial. Adams was not a fool. He was, however, alone. Alexander Hamilton no longer held office but still whispered from the shadows, urging war with France. Jefferson, serving as vice president, was technically Adams's subordinate and practically his enemy. Congress argued while the Treasury bled. Worst of all, Adams understood something no one dared say aloud. If the army fractured, the presidency meant nothing, and the army was already cracking. At Fort Adams on the Mississippi frontier, soldiers began selling ammunition to settlers for food. At Fort Jay in New York Harbor, sailors refused orders to board frozen ships without back pay. In Kentucky, a militia unit simply went home. No mutiny trial followed. There was no one to conduct it. The founders had feared standing armies for good reason. A professional force without loyalty to civilian authority was a threat to liberty. But a starving army without loyalty to anyone was worse. Captain Jonah Kincaid wrote 3 letters in February, one to the War Department requesting supplies, one to the governor of Virginia requesting guidance, one he never sent to his wife, apologizing for what he suspected he might have to do soon. He burned that 3rd letter after 2 of his men deserted in the night, taking rifles with them. In Richmond, Eli Turner sat in a cell barely wider than his shoulders. The Sedition Act trial moved quickly. It always did. Truth was not a defense. Intent was irrelevant. The only question was whether his words could be interpreted as weakening confidence in the government. They could. They always could. Turner was sentenced to 4 months in prison and a fine he could not pay. Outside the courthouse, his printing press was dismantled. Not destroyed. Claimed. By whom, no one could quite say. Across the country, similar seizures took place. Newspapers went silent not because editors agreed, but because presses changed hands overnight. Licenses vanished. Ink shipments failed to arrive. Information slowed. Rumor accelerated. In taverns and churches, Americans began asking a question that frightened them more than foreign enemies. What if the government is lying because it is already finished? By March, Jefferson had reached a conclusion Adams never would. The Constitution, as written, could not survive what was coming. Jefferson did not say this publicly. Instead, he wrote letters, dozens of them, carefully worded, plausibly deniable. Letters asking governors what they would do if federal law became temporarily inapplicable. Letters asking whether states retained ultimate authority in emergencies. Letters that never mentioned rebellion but described its outline with surgical precision. James Madison helped draft some of them, not with ink, with implication. This was the moment when the United States came closest to becoming something else entirely. Not a dictatorship, not a monarchy, but a loose confederation of regional powers, technically united, practically independent. The very thing the Constitution had been designed to prevent. And the irony was unbearable. It was the Constitution itself that stood in the way of survival. In late March, Adams made a decision that would define his presidency and nearly erase it from memory. He authorized a meeting that did not officially occur. No minutes were recorded, no votes taken, no record entered into the Congressional Journal. 3 men attended. 1 represented the executive branch, 1 represented the military, 1 represented no office at all. Samuel Harker's ledger recorded only this: unscheduled conference, location undisclosed, duration 7 hours. Then, for the first time, the ledger's handwriting changed. It became hurried, uneven, afraid. What was decided in that room violated multiple laws. What was authorized contradicted the Constitution's plain text. What was concealed prevented civil war. The agreement was simple in concept and explosive in consequence. The federal government would temporarily stop enforcing its own authority in certain regions, not publicly, not formally, quietly. Tax collection would pause, arrests under the Sedition Act would cease, militia units would be allowed to answer to state governors instead of federal command, for now. In exchange, the states would not secede. They would not raise independent armies. They would wait. This was not compromise. It was surrender disguised as patience, and it worked. By April, food shipments resumed along thawing rivers. Desertion slowed. Printers returned to work under new names. The quasi-war with France de-escalated quietly as Adams sent peace envoys against Hamilton's furious objections. The Union breathed again. Barely. Samuel Harker understood what his ledger represented. Proof. Proof that the federal government had stepped outside the law to save the law. Proof that the nation survived not because its rules held, but because they were bent until they nearly broke. When the order came to burn the ledger, it was delivered without a threat. It did not need one. Harker burned it because he believed the alternative was worse, because Americans needed to believe their country had survived cleanly, because myths were sometimes more stable than truth. John Adams would lose re-election. Jefferson would win. The Alien and Sedition Acts would expire, quietly. The crisis would be remembered as political tension, not existential failure. And the most dangerous winter in American history would be reduced to footnotes. But the silence Samuel Harker noticed that morning in 1798 was real. The abandonment was real. The near collapse was real. And the lesson remains buried for a reason. Because the United States did not survive by following its ideals perfectly. It survived by choosing survival first and trusting history to forgive the rest.
History prefers clean endings. This one did not have one. By the spring of 1799, the Union was still standing, but it was standing on ground that had quietly shifted beneath it. The agreement Adams authorized had stabilized the surface while poisoning the foundation. Everyone involved understood that the calm was temporary. The question was not if the truth would resurface, it was who would control it when it did. Thomas Jefferson moved faster than anyone realized. Publicly, he spoke of reconciliation, of healing, of restoring Republican virtue after Federalist access. Privately, he compiled information with obsessive care. Jefferson believed history was a weapon, and he intended to wield it. He instructed allies and state governments to preserve correspondence, selectively. Certain letters were copied, others were misplaced. Some originals were quietly destroyed, while summaries were retained, stripped of context. Jefferson was not erasing the crisis, he was reframing it. In his version, the danger came not from collapse, but from tyranny narrowly averted. The villain would be the Alien and Sedition Acts. The hero would be the people. The near death of the Union itself would be minimized, because a republic that admits it nearly failed cannot easily demand loyalty. Adonai understood this too late. Adams had never been a charismatic man. He believed duty mattered more than popularity, law more than applause. But he also believed, wrongly, that doing the right thing would eventually be recognized as such. Instead, he found himself isolated. Hamilton despised him. Jefferson undermined him. Congress tolerated him. And the public blamed him. When Adams sent envoys to France to quietly end the quasi-war, it saved American shipping and destroyed his political base. Federalists called it weakness. Democratic Republicans called it admission of guilt. In truth, it was neither. It was exhaustion. Meanwhile, the military remained a question mark no one wanted to reopen. Captain Jonah Kincaid received new orders in May. They restored pay. They promised supplies. They demanded renewed loyalty. Kincaid complied. So did most officers. But something had changed permanently. The men had learned the government could bend, and soldiers, once taught that lesson, never forget it. Years later, when officers spoke of civilian supremacy, it would be with reverence, but also with calculation.
1799 had taught them where the line truly was. In Richmond, Eli Turner walked free in early summer. His sentence had expired. His fine had not been paid, but enforcement had lapsed. No apology came, no restitution. His printing press was gone. His name was known, his future uncertain. Turner tried to publish again under a pseudonym. It failed. Readers were wary now. Words had become dangerous. The chilling effect the Sedition Act created outlived the law itself. That, too, would be forgotten. Samuel Harker stayed in government service for 3 more years. He was never promoted. He was never reprimanded. He existed in a strange limbo, too useful to dismiss, too dangerous to elevate. Harker understood why. He remembered details no one else did. He remembered how close things had come to unraveling. He remembered the faces of men who had authorized illegal acts for the sake of continuity. And he remembered their fear. In 1801, Jefferson took office. The transfer of power was peaceful, celebrated, framed as proof that the American experiment worked. It did, only because of what happened in the shadows. Jefferson called it a revolution of 1800. He meant ideological realignment. But there had already been a revolution, a silent one where the Constitution had been suspended without announcement, violated without record, and restored without confession. Within months, Jefferson ordered a review of federal archives. Officially, it was about organization. Unofficially, it was about containment. Documents vanished. Others were reclassified under vague headings. A few survived, but only because they appeared mundane. Supply delays, budget discrepancies, administrative confusion. No single document told the story. That had been the brilliance of Adams's decision. Fragment the truth, and history cannot assemble it. By 1803, America was expanding westward. By 1807, it was asserting itself abroad. By 1812, it would fight Britain again. The near collapse of 1798 to 1799 became an inconvenience, an anomaly better left unexplored. Textbooks would later describe the period as politically turbulent. That was like describing a heart attack as physically uncomfortable. The most dangerous legacy of that winter was not hunger or censorship. It was precedent. The precedent that in an existential crisis, laws could be set aside quietly, that unity could be preserved through selective enforcement, that survival justified secrecy. Future presidents would remember this, not consciously, but instinctively. In 1861, when Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, he would face similar accusations. In 1933, when Roosevelt expanded executive power to combat collapse, echoes would resurface. In moments of national panic, America would not look only to its ideals. It would look to its buried memories, to the year it survived by breaking its own rules. Samuel Harker died in 1836. His obituary was brief. Faithful civil servant, survived the revolution. It did not mention the winter that nearly erased the nation. Among his personal effects, his family found a single scrap of paper, a line he had copied from memory before burning the ledger. The nation endured because the truth did not. They didn't understand it. No one did. And that, perhaps, was the point. Because the most fragile part of the American experiment has never been its laws, or its armies, or its borders. It has always been the story Americans tell themselves about how they survived.
The truth did not stay buried because it was hidden well. It stayed buried because when it surfaced, no one wanted it. In 1804, 5 years after the winter that nearly erased the Union, a junior archivist in Washington made a mistake that should have changed American history. His name was Caleb Morris. He was methodical, painfully so, the kind of man who believed order itself was a moral act. Morris had been tasked with reorganizing correspondence from the Adams administration. Nothing controversial, nothing urgent, just papers deemed too old to matter. That assumption was the danger. In a mislabeled box marked Revenue Adjustments, 1799, Morris found fragments that did not belong together, but fit too well to be coincidence.
A letter from a customs official in Massachusetts noting temporary suspension of federal collection by verbal instruction. A militia roster from Virginia annotated with the phrase, answerable to state authority until further notice. A shipping ledger showing naval patrols abruptly withdrawn from key ports without explanation. None of these documents were illegal on their own. Together, they were explosive. Morris did not rush. He cross-referenced. Weeks passed, then months. He noticed something chilling. Every gap, every unexplained pause, every missing enforcement action traced back to the same narrow window, March to April 1799. The exact period history described as a de-escalation of tensions. Morris realized he was looking at evidence of something no textbook acknowledged, a coordinated federal retreat, not defeat, withdrawal. He brought his findings to a superior. The man skimmed the papers, nodded once, and returned them without comment. A week later, Morris was reassigned. Not fired, not punished, reassigned to a position with no access to archives. It was a kindness masquerading as a warning. But Morris had already copied the documents. Not all of them, just enough. He believed, naively, that transparency would strengthen the Republic, that Americans could handle the truth. He was wrong. In 1805, an anonymous pamphlet appeared in Baltimore. Its title was cautious, on certain administrative irregularities of the late federal government. No accusations, no names, just questions. Why had tax enforcement paused without congressional approval? Why had militia chains of command blurred? Why had censorship prosecutions abruptly ceased before the Sedition Act expired? The pamphlet did not claim conspiracy. It didn't need to. Readers supplied it themselves. The reaction was swift and deeply uncomfortable. Federalists dismissed it as rumor. Jeffersonian Republicans hesitated. This was not the story they wanted. They had built their legitimacy on opposing tyranny, not explaining collapse. If the public believed the Union had survived only through secret illegality, then the Constitution looked less like a foundation and more like a suggestion. Jefferson himself read the pamphlet in silence. He recognized the danger immediately, not to his administration, to the idea of American exceptionalism itself, the belief that this republic was different, cleaner, straighter, guided by reason rather than desperation. That belief could not survive this truth. The response was subtle. No arrests, no censorship laws. Instead, indifference. The pamphlet was ignored by major newspapers. Reviewers dismissed it as speculative. Printers declined reprints. Within a year, it was unavailable. Not banned, simply gone. The most effective burial is the one that looks like disinterest. Caleb Morris never published again. He remained a clerk. He married. He lived quietly. In 2021, during the Missouri crisis, he wrote a letter to a friend containing only one line: "We are pretending again." The letter was never answered. What finally sealed the story's fate was not suppression, but competition. America grew, faster than anyone expected. Expansion replaced introspection. New territories, new wars, new heroes. The nation learned to look forward instinctively, backward only selectively. The winter of 1798-1799 did not fit the narrative of destiny. It suggested fragility, and fragility was un-American. By the time professional historians emerged in the mid-19th century, the sources were already compromised. Letters missing, files reorganized, decisions attributed to administrative confusion. No single villain, no smoking gun, only silence. Historians require evidence. The evidence had been scattered just enough. Yet the pattern repeated. In every American crisis, echoes appeared. In moments of fear, enforcement softened in some places and hardened in others. Authority bent quietly. Later, history smoothed the edges. Always. The winter America almost died taught its leaders an unspoken rule: never admit how close the edge truly was, because a nation built on confidence cannot afford to remember how fragile it once felt. Somewhere in a private collection in New England, there still exists a copy of Morris's pamphlet. Its pages are brittle, its margins annotated by an unknown hand. Next to one passage, a note is written in faded ink. Truth is not dangerous, timing is. And that may be the final, uncomfortable lesson of the year America was supposed to die. Not that the nation nearly collapsed, but that it survived and then chose to forget why.